Hello there, my name's David Hurrian and I'd like to welcome you to this BBC Gardeners World magazine masterclass online all about how to create a container garden, and this is part 2. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start. To ensure you've got the best reception with this masterclass, or if you're concerned about your internet connection, then please try and minimise all your other internet usage, things like email, etc., because that will have an effect on your viewing. If you do experience any problems during the class, then please simply refresh your browser and rejoin. And if you do see a large button pop up in the middle of the screen prompting you to play audio, then please select that. If for any reason you can't view the videos or something goes wrong, then after this masterclass we'll send you an email with a link of how you can both download notes for this class, but also how you can view a recording of this for a limited period. The idea behind all our masterclasses is that you can sit back and relax and absorb the whole masterclass learning as we go along, and the session has been carefully designed so that it's structured, and if a question does ping into your mind about something particular that I'm talking about, then sometimes it's worth being patient, because before long I'm likely to mention the answer to your question. However, there is a Q&A section at the side of your screen which does allow you to ask particular questions, and we do welcome those questions to come in. If you can't see that, then look to the right of your screen at the bottom and you'll see a button with chat on it. Click on that chat button and that will open up the Q&A section, and then you can ask your question. We'll then curate the questions that come in, put them up in the same viewer for you to vote on, and then you can vote for your favourites. That will be curated by my colleague. I'll then answer the most popular questions at the end of the session, when my colleague will join us and put those questions to me. Do bear in mind that while you're concentrating on typing in your question, though, that I may well have answered your question in passing anyway. Don't forget there are comprehensive notes which we are going to send to you at the end of this masterclass, or which you can download from this viewing screen, but I'll give you more information about that at the end of the session. So let's get started. So one of the most important questions is, why do we grow in containers over the autumn, winter and spring? Particularly when we've just gone through the summer, when everything has been a riot of colour, then surely you can give a pause to all that splash of colour and just rest for a while. But actually, gardening in containers is great because we generally do it immediately outside the rooms, the windows of our homes, and it's in the most visible position. It doesn't just have to be for summer. Make sure that you keep that colour in your garden, or the interest in your garden, or even on your balcony, for as long as possible, and it will help you engage with the outside world. It allows you to decorate specific parts of the garden, and it adds valuable seasonal colour, as I've already said, and creates interest and variety, particularly if you can include things that will attract wildlife to your garden, things that will attract bees and other pollinators in the last days of summer and into the autumn, but also early in the spring and the summer. No garden, if you don't have a garden, isn't a problem. You can garden on a balcony or on a windowsill and inject lots and lots of colour and interest to your surroundings with container gardening. It's also a really useful thing if you've got a paved garden. Sometimes we find in new developments that the gardens have been completely paved, or you might want to have a courtyard garden, and of course containers allow you to decorate it. So really useful to know what to decorate your garden with during the winter months. You might also have a garden that's got very poor quality soil in it, and the best way to create ideal growing conditions may be to actually just garden in raised beds or containers rather than in the natural ground soil. And the other thing about gardening in containers is that it can often bring plants up to your own height, where you can view the plants more easily. Particularly if you're looking out of the windows at different parts of your garden, planting in containers can often just add that few extra feet or centimetres of height so that you can see things from the window that you wouldn't normally see. It also really unusually allows you to tailor the soil conditions to grow a much more varied range of plants. So for example, if you want to grow rhododendrons and azaleas in your garden, some of which are quite early flowering, then giving them acid soil conditions is really crucial, and your natural soil may be alkaline, high levels of pH, which means that you can't grow them in your own natural soil. So container gardening gives you that extra flexibility. You can visibly see the plants as well that you grow in containers, and that allows you to monitor them really carefully. And so if something goes wrong with your plants, you can see them because they're raised up in a container, and you can do something about it quite quickly. And of course, the other thing that container gardening allows you to do is when you come to arranging them in your plot or even on a balcony, you can create a specific layout or design style to your plot, and that really gives you the ultimate flexibility. Imagine like being able to rearrange the furniture in your living room. The gardening in containers allows you to do much the same thing. Now, we've just come out of a summer that's been very warm and hot and sunny, and you're thinking ahead to the autumn, late autumn and on into the winter months when it's obviously a lot darker and cooler and colder. And a lot of those summer plants are already starting to deteriorate. So really resist the temptation to leave those plants in place for as long as possible, get them out of the way and reintroduce some more colourful plants certainly for autumn. That's a really good idea to zhuzh up your garden, zhuzh up your balcony, to exchange those summer flowering fading plants for something really colourful. And there's a whole mass of plants that have that instant colour, and you can browse around garden centres. There's a whole host of different plants that can be used. And of course that gives you the opportunity to create new focal points in your garden, to bring on the palettes of autumn with their subtle differences, the rich reds and the rich yellows and oranges of autumn. A lot of these autumn container plants really complement all those autumnal shades. And of course, if you think really ahead, you can incorporate some winter flowering plants or winter foliage plants in those containers, as well as spring bulbs, but more of that in a moment. Winter containers, really it's all about having longevity and being tough enough to survive the winter months, the cold, dark days of winter. Autumn, just going back to think about autumn, is often quite mild and warm, and you can keep plants going for a long time. But by the time it comes through to winter, you really want tough, reliable, often evergreen plants that are able to still give you interest despite the weather conditions. So again, you can create focal points with containers planted up with bold foliage colours or bold foliage shapes in the form of things like magnolia, which we've got in the top left-hand picture shown on your screen, and also those colourful autumn or winter cabbages spaced around that bold mahonia. It really does have lots of impact and will draw the eye and create a focal point. You can also position winter containers close to doors and entrances and back gates into gardens where they'll welcome you home, and it's always great to have that splash of colour to make you realise that, you know, the winter can be colourful as well. They're such a welcome thing in those dark days of winter, both for you and for visitors. Remember, however, unlike summer planting, when it comes to winter planting of containers, you need to plant the plants densely because they won't make much growth during the winter months, so pack them in closely. And again, in the same way as for autumn, there are all sorts of foliage, some flowers, but also lots of berried plants and plants with colourful winter stems that you can be creative with in your containers. Thinking ahead to spring, and this is something you can do both in autumn flowering containers or autumn display containers as well as the winter ones, is to include spring flowers in there. Now, they won't necessarily perform until the warmer, brighter, lighter days of spring, but things like spring bulbs and also spring flowering annual plants or spring flowering perennial plants will really add a real hope for the arrival of spring after the dark days of winter. So think about those when you're creating your containers. Underplant some of the winter flowering plants, for example, or the winter display plants with spring flowering bulbs, and then you'll have a real right of colour to look forward to. The compost for these winter containers is really important. I'm a great believer in using suitable composts for growing in containers full stop. So rather than using bagged containers straight off the shelf, I would always mix a specific container recipe with using composts of different types. So for example, I'd use bags of peat-free compost mixed with loam to create good long-lasting composts for my pots. But in winter this is even more important. So you need to think about not just the feeding of the plants, but also the moisture retention to keep the plants alive, but probably most importantly of all, the drainage of the compost, because you certainly don't want the plants sitting in water over the winter months. So we're now going to watch a first video all about my recipe for making sure that you could produce the best compost for your winter containers. When it comes to potting up anything really in a container, I like to try and mimic the natural soil that you'd find in a garden or anywhere really. So making sure that it's got a mixture of mineral matter as well as organic matter, because there are two inputs into any good soil. The organic matter that comes in from the top, which is decomposing leaves and other stuff that's been living, as well as the mineral matter that comes from the rocks underneath and feeds into the soil. Now if you just rely on using a bagged compost, a multi-purpose bagged compost, most of those, whether they be peat based or peat free, will be based on purely organic matter. There won't be very much mineral matter in those at all, and the problem is that if you put that compost into a pot, then it will just decompose in the pot almost like a compost heap, and the air will react with the carbon in that carbon compost, that organic compost, and it will react and give off carbon dioxide, and gradually you'll find that the level in the pot will go down and down and down. Now that's not so much of a problem in the short term, but I think it's really important that we try and make our composts that we put into pots as sustainable as possible and as long lasting as possible. So what I do is I mix different compost constituents together, almost like a Mary Berry recipe. So this is the sort of stuff that I end up with, which is a mixture of all my basic ingredients that will retain moisture, that will retain a structure in a pot and won't decompose very quickly in any case, and also opens the structure so that you get air at the roots as well as moisture, because that's really crucial, particularly in the winter when you've got a lot of rain coming down into a container that could really waterlog that container and cause some of the roots to rot. So I mix up using these ingredients. So I've got my homemade garden compost here, which has been sieved. So this is organic matter effectively. It doesn't have to be homemade garden compost. It could be any green waste compost. And that provides the organic matter as if it were the feed that comes into the top of the soil. So this has been all the once living material that's been decomposed down into this lovely fibrous stuff. And the thing about this is that it's very difficult to compact it. You can see that if I squeeze it together, it just breaks up afterwards, and that is what really benefits the soil or the compost, holding the structure open, particularly when it's in a pot. I've also got here this is good quality soil, and this is really referred to as loam. You can buy bags of loam or you can buy good quality topsoil. Make sure it is the good stuff rather than poor quality, because you really do get what you pay for when it comes to topsoil and loam. And this has got a lot of mineral matter in it, generally quite sandy loam, with some silt in there and other smaller particles that really go to make up a good quality soil. And then the third constituent I've got here, or ingredient really if you like, is this coarse horticultural grit. This is very sharp and angular, different sizes, some small pieces, some slightly larger pieces, and the benefit of this is that it will help to hold the compost or the soil open. It doesn't need to be rounded almost like pea shingle, because that really won't hold the mineral matter and also the organic matter. It won't hold it open. Great stuff for adding good drainage and aeration. Now I mix these in the proportion by volume of 1 part grit, horticultural grit, by volume, just measure it out in a flower pot really by volume, to 2 parts of the loam by volume, to 3 parts of the organic matter. And that means that you've got enough organic matter in that homemade compost to last for a couple of seasons. This will help to keep it open. The coarse grit will help to keep the compost open and aerated. The loam will help to hold on to nutrients and will also help to improve the structure in a pot, and the organic matter will decompose to release other nutrients that will help things when they come to grow. And really that's all you need. This is the best mixture that I use, particularly in the winter, where I'm trying to make sure that the pots don't become waterlogged. And it's also a really useful mixture to have in the summer, so that you can retain moisture and nutrients for your plants. So as you can see from that video, it's really crucial to make up a good mix of soil containing both loam as well as organic matter and plenty of drainage material. Now, if you've got compost already in your containers from the summer, you can reuse some of that compost, but it's worth replacing a large proportion of it, or even taking the whole of the compost out of the container and mixing it, say 50-50 in proportion, with some fresh compost. And that's because the compost that's been in those containers over the summer will have deteriorated to some extent. And that's because, particularly with compost that you use straight out of the bag, the organic matter that they contain will actually decompose. It carries on really like a compost heap in a pot, if you like. That organic matter will continue to decay, and you'll probably have seen that the level of the compost has dropped during the course of the summer months. And that's because the organic matter is being oxidized, used up with air from the air in the environment. So that carbon that's in the organic matter combines with oxygen to give off carbon dioxide. Now, a byproduct of that will be that the material in the pot, a lot of the organic matter will have broken down into small particles, and those are called fines. And if they wash down into the bottom of the pot, they can actually block up the aeration and also the drainage holes at the bottom of the pot, so they can impede drainage. So it's worth digging the old compost out of the pots, mixing it, as I say, 50-50 with some fresh compost to make sure that the structure is nice and open, or indeed substituting all of the compost for fresh and using the old compost on your beds and borders in the open garden. Now, that drainage and aeration is really crucial, because plants don't want to be waterlogged over the winter months. They need air at their roots, as well as they need moisture and nutrients to help them keep ticking over. So any container that you choose should have adequate drainage provision. If you're planting into a half barrel, for example, it's absolutely crucial that you make sure it's got plenty of drainage holes drilled in with a large drill bit to help drain away the excess moisture. And any pots that you purchase, things like clay, terracotta, glazed pots, or even plastic pots, check that they've all got adequate drainage. And if you're uncertain, then perhaps choose other containers instead. Look for ones with the biggest possible drainage holes, because that will benefit you, particularly in the winter when it's so crucial. It's also key to make sure that you have a good layer, a good drainage layer in the bottom of the pot over the winter. Now, in the summer, you'll want to retain moisture in the pots wherever possible. So drainage is less crucial, although it's still fundamental to the plant's survival. But in the winter, potential for waterlogging those containers is very real. So it's absolutely essential that you make sure that you've got drainage crocks in the bottom, and I'll talk more about that in our next video, but then also perhaps a layer of gravel in the bottom of the pot, and then make sure that you've got a compost, as we've already considered, that's got plenty of drainage material added to it, and that way you'll create good aeration and good drainage. So we're now going to watch a video about why it's absolutely crucial to add crocks to the bottom of a winter container. There's a lot of controversy when it comes to drainage materials in pots and containers when you're growing. And I'm a real fan of making sure that we've got good drainage in winter, in the autumn and the winter, in our pots, so that the plants don't become waterlogged and a proportion of the roots don't rot off. In the summer, it's a different matter. You want to actually stop the water draining from the pot. You want it to accumulate, to build up, so that you've got enough water in the pot to keep the plants happy. However, even in a very, very dry summer, you don't want to have a pot that doesn't have any drainage holes in it, because ultimately the water flowing through the pot, down through the pot, actually sucks fresh air into the top. As I've already said, in the autumn and winter that drainage is really crucial, so I'm a great believer in crocking pots, and that simply means adding drainage material to the bottom, particularly in things like this. So this is a glazed terracotta pot, a glazed pottery container. That glaze on the outside stops any water being wicked away or sapped away, and it's only got one drainage hole in the bottom of that container, and that means that if the roots of the plants have got to stay well drained and aerated, that one hole has got to drain all the water away. It's quite a different matter when you look at a plastic pot. Most plastic pots have a whole range of holes in the bottom because they're easier to cast into the plastic, or vacuum cast into the plastic when they're made. So less of a problem with drainage in plastic containers, a real problem I think with terracotta and particularly glazed containers. So what are the sorts of drainage materials that you could use? Well, probably the most traditional thing is to use broken terracotta pot, pieces of broken terracotta pot, particularly with single drainage hole containers like this, because this single piece of crock, as they're called, can just go straight over that one drainage hole and still allow water to drain through. But I wouldn't just put one piece in, I would put a whole collection of this. So this is from my broken pots bucket, and all sorts of the angular pieces. You can see this bit, which is from the bottom of the pot here. This means that angular cracked piece will actually bridge over the drainage hole at the bottom and keep aeration and keep that drainage hole open. So this is a really good bit that can go in there as well, and then there's a few more angular bits like that as well, and I would probably put about 4 or 5 pieces of that material in the bottom of a pot. An alternative would be to use cobbles or pebbles. Now these have a bit of a problem in as much as, because they're round, the compost can actually envelop that whole stone, and that can impede drainage. So you can't keep the drainage hole open so efficiently with cobbles like this, really. So avoid rounded pieces, but angular bits of old broken concrete, they're really good as well, because you can again bridge the drainage hole like that and use a number of pieces in the bottom. And then the other thing that I like to do is to get some of this sharp horticultural grit, or you could use just a coarse grit of any sort, really. It doesn't need to be horticultural. And then I pour a little bit of this in the bottom of the pot, not too much. And what that does is it actually fills in the spaces between the crocks and packs in between them, particularly if you just lightly push it down together. But the angular, sharp nature of this grit will actually hold open air spaces, and that will really make sure that this pot doesn't become waterlogged during the winter. So that drainage material that you put in the bottom in the form of crocks, whether it be unfortunately broken terracotta pots or even, you know, large pieces of masonry or anything that adds drainage to the bottom to keep those drainage holes open, is absolutely fundamental to success with winter containers. Now, when you're emptying out your summer pots and containers to make way for all this wonderful autumn, winter and spring colour, it's worth bearing in mind which plants you might be able to save from the summer, which will both save you money in the long term and which will also help to benefit the environment, because the fewer plants that you have to go and buy, the fewer plants that have to be grown in commercial glasshouses really does make a difference to our impact on the environment. So things like pelargoniums, things that are tender perennials, for example, pelargoniums and fuchsias, begonias, as we're seeing on the screen, all those pictures of all those tender perennial plants that can be lifted and repotted and brought under cover to be kept in frost-free conditions indoors, just ticking over in frost-free conditions. Those plants will regrow next year, and you can keep those plants, as I say, just ticking over. Keep them on the dry side. Don't encourage lots of growth. Some of them may actually go dormant and die down to a resting crown underground, or you might find that all the leaves from those plants drop off. But don't worry about that. Keep them ticking over. Keep them just moist. And they'll come back next year. Start them back into growth in about March or April next year, and then you can use them for next year's summer displays. You may also have used some hardy plants in your summer containers, and in which case those can be lifted from the pots and perhaps planted out in the wider garden if you have one, or potted up individually into smaller pots and then kept on a patio or on a balcony, ready to replant your summer pots next year. This is really the fundamentals of making container gardening sustainable, that and obviously making sure that you've got a good quality growing medium in the first place. Now, there may be some things that you've grown in containers permanently and taken out for the summer months, and as soon as the weather starts to take a turn for the cooler overnight conditions in particular, as soon as you're going to see temperatures dropping below around 5 degrees Celsius, then it's worth considering as that being the time to bring those tender plants indoors under cover into a frost-free greenhouse or a frost-free conservatory, or even an unheated shed in some cases, as long as it's got a window, somewhere where you can keep those plants away from the worst of the frost. If you've got a balcony that's got an overhang from a balcony above, then you can actually even section off part of that balcony with polythene and create a sheltered environment. You may find that those tender plants are able to survive left outside as well. And as our winters become ever warmer, there are a lot more plants that can be left outdoors during the winter. But I'm thinking particularly about things like pelargoniums again, that are grown long term in large containers, or things like hedechiums, the ginger lilies, which you can see top left, Carol Klein bringing one of her ginger lilies undercover into a frost-free greenhouse for the winter. There are plenty of plants that just benefit from that extra bit of winter protection, and then they can go out for the summer next year. And it might even be that you've put some of your some of your house plants outside for the summer, and in which case, as soon as those temperatures drop below around 5 Celsius, it's time to bring them back indoors. Keep them cosy for the winter months. So we're now going to watch a video about planting up a superb, colourful winter container that will not only look good during the coming days into the winter, but also look great in the spring next year. Now, when it gets to the end of summer, you really want to be in there straight away as soon as possible, clearing out your summer bedding plants from pots and containers, clearing the way and making room for the spring flowering bulbs, but also some winter flowering plants as well. If you leave it too long, you'll find that the bulbs take longer to establish. So it's a really good idea when you get to around September time, second week in September or so, to get in there, rip out the summer stuff and plant your winter displays. Now I tend to use autumn and winter flowering plants for my displays, and then I underplant to grow through those autumn and winter flowering plants. I underplant with bulbs. So that means that I get a really good chorus of spring colour from the bulbs, and then the autumn and winter flowering stuff keeps the show going through the darkest days. But if you just use spring flowering bedding plants with the spring flowering bulbs, then it just makes too much of a fuss, you get too much colour, and also you've got nothing to look at in the winter months. So that's why I choose to grow winter display plants. Now this pot had summer bedding in it, it's been emptied out, some of the plants have been kept ready for next year, some of the tender perennial things, and then I've emptied the compost out and I've refilled it with some gritty mix, some gritty loam mix with some organic matter in there as well. The sort of mixture that I made up in the first video that we showed on this masterclass. It's got lots of good organic matter in it, and it's also got loam, so that all important loam to help the nutrients stay there, to stop the pot being too free draining during the winter, but also allowing enough drainage with the grit in there so that any excess rain can drain away. I would always start with some spring bulbs. So I've emptied it out and I've filled it up to about 2/3 the depth of the pot. I'm using a nice big pot, about 45 centimetres across, 45 centimetres across, and a similar sort of depth, which means that the pot was less likely to dry out in the winter so much. And then I've got these fantastic little dwarf narcissi here. These are lovely, lovely narcissi. They come in all different shapes and sizes. So I'm going to put this first layer in. These big bulbs are the first ones to go in, and I'm just gently resting them onto the surface of the compost. I'm not pushing that bulb down into that compost because the bottom of the bulb has what's called a basal plate, and that's where the roots will come from. And if you push that down too hard into the compost, you'll find that it will push the bulb up. And then just space them out reasonably evenly. I've got 10 bulbs here. I'm just going to spread them around the outside of the pot, probably about 3 to 4 centimetres in from the edge, and then put a few in the middle, a little group of 3 in the middle of the pot there. So with the bulbs in, I'm now going to cover with some of my fresh compost. So this is my gritty, loamy mixture, and I'm just going to sprinkle that around the bulbs. I'm not going to force it around the bulbs, I'm just loosely filling around the bulbs just to keep that structure nice and open. You don't want to bury them too deeply at this stage. There we go, and then that's those covered. So I'm ready for my next layer, and I've got some crocus here. I've also got some miniature iris reticulata. They're really good for early in the season. But I've also got some miniature tulips here, and these aren't as big as the narcissus bulbs. These are reasonably large. These don't get too tall either. They're not like the big Mayflowered tulip. So these are in that next layer up. So I can put these in similar sort of fashion to how I put the daffodils in. These will flower at a different time, generally speaking, probably a little bit later than the daffs or the narcissi. And again, spacing these out, I've got 10 of these bulbs, just spacing them around in a circle all the way around the outside of the pot. And then I'm ready for my next layer of compost. Again, just a little bit just to cover those bulbs. We don't want to come up too high in the pot because we've got some planting to do on the top with the other plants. So now we're really ready to put in the iris. So these bulbs I'm going to put in little groups of 3 around the edge of the pot. So just pop 3 in here like this, cluster them together, because together they'll make a really good effect. And you'll see them in amongst the plants at the edge of the pot rather than buried in the middle of the pot. Now the crocuses are going to go in around the edge when I've planted all the other plants, because they're quite small bulbs and quite flat, and they like good drainage. They don't mind being close to the surface of the compost, so they'll survive. So I'm going to go in and now start planting from the back around the sides and then towards the front, and then fill in with the middle with my plants. Now, heathers, winter flowering heathers, are really good. All of these plants have been wet before, soaked before I plant them. Winter flowering heathers coming into flower now. This is called a bud heather. I'm going to pop these at the back, and I'm just going to push them down on top of those bulbs. Don't worry about pushing too hard, but I'm just going to pop those at the back so I've got some height in the middle at the back. So the Latin name is Calluna for these, but look out for the bud ones because they're nice and upright and they're covered in flower buds that will come out pink during the course of the winter months. Then I'm going to next pop in these Carex grasses. So these are really good plants. All of these are quite cheap and reasonable at this time of year. They're actually sold for this, precisely for this purpose. So I'm going to pop these Carex, I've got 2 of those. These need to be planted quite closely together so that you get that instant effect. Then I'm going to pop these 2 variegated ivies, which I've got. Those are really great for trailing at the front of the pot. And ivy is incredibly tough, so you can actually squash the root ball of the ivy, flatten it if you like, so that you can get it tucked right up to the edge of the pot so that it will trail over and look really attractive. So I've just popped those in at the front there. I've also got this Gaultheria, which is a lovely thing. It's in flower at the moment, and then it has these beautiful red berries that smell of oil of wintergreen. So that's really nice. That can pop in at the front of the pot there. Here's my other ivy, my other variegated ivy. Again, squash that root ball so that you can get it nice and close to the edge here. And those will continue to grow quite slowly, but continue to drape over the edge. And then I've bought 2 different sorts of plants with flowers on. So I've got my lovely cyclamen. These are dwarf florist cyclamen here. These will flower on and off right the way through the autumn into the winter whenever there's mild weather, and they do smell absolutely delightful, particularly this pinkish colour. Be really gentle with them because you can break a lot of the leaves off if you're not careful. And I'm going to pop one of these cyclamen either side where I can see them now, because that will make the display look instantly good. Again, I'm just popping them over the top of those iris bulbs that I've put in as my last bulb layer. And then I've also got these mini violas. These are spring flowering really. They're producing a few early flowers, but they'll produce most of their flowers come the spring. So I'm just going to pop these in to help fill in between the other plants. I need a little bit more compost in there, just to fill up a little bit. And these can be spaced a little bit further apart because these will carry on growing whenever the weather is quite mild. So we've got that pink around the edge. We've got the white flowers of the Gaultheria that will go red berries later on in the winter, and all that variegation. And don't forget, we've got all those bulbs to pop up. I would fill in now between the individual plants, fill in with a little bit of extra compost around the edge here, right at the front edge. There's a little gap, so trickle that compost in and to fill the spaces between. And then when you've done that, you can then take your little crocus corms and just push these into that loose compost around the edge so that these will come into flower in around about the beginning of March time. They need to go in about 3 or 4 centimetres deep. Finish off like that, and we've got a great pot that we will get lots of colour out of it right the way through the autumn, through the winter, and on well into spring. So there's loads of inspiration. We'll look at some more of that inspiration in a moment of what to plant in autumn, winter and spring containers. So there's no excuse for not having a riot of colour to look forward to. Now we've already seen that a lot of the colour in spring comes from bulbs that we plant in that layer fashion in a number of discrete layers underneath its topping of permanent plants over the top. And there is so much to choose from. You don't need to just choose the plants that I've shown you in the video. So we've already looked at the Iris reticulata, for example, those winter flowering irises. There are then the muscari, so this is going along the top line of photos, muscari. There are also spring snowflakes. Don't mistake that picture for snowdrops. These are called spring snowflakes, or the leucojums, which are about flowering about the end of March or into April, and those are really great for a little bit of later spring colour. Then of course things like narcissus and daffodils, again remember to choose the shorter varieties, because in pots they can often get quite tall. The taller varieties might end up flopping, so go for the shorter varieties where possible. Same really applies for tulips. And then if you want some real stature in the centre of a pot as a real big centrepiece, then that last picture on that top line is of Fritillaria imperialis. These are massive bulbs that need to be planted low in the container, and then they will erupt in around April or May time to produce this huge flower spike with these beautiful bells of flower. The only downside is that they've got a bit of a foxy smell when they're in flower. And then along the bottom row we've got traditional things like crocus, which is the lovely yellow flower there, but they obviously come in all sorts of different colours as well. And then pushkinias, the pale blue pushkinia, then scillas, Iphian, and then thinking ahead to April-May time, big allium, drumstick heads of allium with those beautiful purple flowers, and of course the florist's anemone, which is the beautiful bright pink flower at the end there. So lots and lots of potential for spring bulbs, and remember to layer them up, planting the biggest bulbs at the bottom, the smaller bulbs towards the surface. That lasagna style of planting will make sure that you get a continuity of fantastic flowers. And then in terms of what to plant over the top of them, really here the choices are less broad, but there are all sorts of biennials and also spring bedding plants, really, for want of a better word. So things like pansies and violas, also the bellis, the daisy flowers, the ornamental daisies. Those are great biennials that do really well in containers and are covered in flower from about March onwards. And then also on the top row we've got the beautiful dianthus there, or sweet William. Those are quite big plants, so you'd need a really big container to show them off to best ability, but they will flower from around May and into early June, so they're great for making that transition in your container from the spring into the summer. And then along the bottom row we've got polyanthus and primroses in a huge variety of different colours. They're a really great plant. They tend to come into flower when the conditions are warm enough, so they might flower on and off throughout the winter and on into the spring. And then wallflowers in the centre at the bottom, a great April-May flower plant that flowers in April-May that teams up incredibly well with tulips. And then last but by no means least, forget-me-nots. That lovely blue of the forget-me-nots is wonderful for pots. A whole host of smaller perennials that come into flower or have foliage effects early in the season. So euphorbias are great, pulmonarias also shown in these slides. And then hellebores, really, there are so many different types of hellebore, both the Christmas and the Lenten roses as we call them commonly. Those are brilliant for growing in containers, and it's a great way to grow these plants on to a larger size, ready to plant out in the larger garden if you have one. But then don't forget ornamental grasses, the ornamental evergreen grasses, particularly the smaller ones that are great in pots. There's the lily turf or the Ophiopogon, which is the top right picture, which is the black grass sometimes called, and then bottom right, carex grasses, absolutely essential for your pots over the winter months and into the spring. Don't forget too that there are plenty of alpines that will flower either in late winter or on into the spring as well, and it will actually broaden out your choice of plants if you consider the alpine plants for sale at garden centres as well. So things like saxifrages, corydales, also the alpine phloxes, There are plenty of plants that they might not look much at this time of year, but they will often have a little mat of evergreen leaves, and then they'll go on to produce lovely early spring flowers. And then there are plenty of small shrubs and conifers to choose from too. So these are often the stalwarts of the winter pot because they often have evergreen colourful leaves and sometimes winter flowers as well. So things like skimmias, which both flower and also produce berries in the winter, depending on whether they're the male or the female forms. Winter flowering heathers, of course some of the small hollies. You can buy those as small plants and put those in hanging baskets and wall-mounted baskets, as well as other containers. And then the Christmas cherry. Now this is the top right picture on your screen with the orange berries. Now that's often sold as a house plant, but it's hardy enough to withstand down to about -2 if necessary. So it's a great autumn into winter plant for injecting a bit of seasonal colour. And then the bottom three, you've got herbs like Santolina with its beautiful greyish foliage there. And then the sage, the tricolour sage, bottom right, a perfect plant for injecting some colourful foliage. And then in the middle, another great stalwart are the small forms of euonymus. This one is a gold one at the bottom called Emerald and Gold, rather predictably. So we're now going to watch a video about how to plant up a permanent container to be able to grow on plants, perhaps to plant out in the broader garden. It's a great way to encourage to be able to buy smaller shrubs that you might want to grow on to a larger size before you commit them to the garden. And it gives you really good value for money because you can make your choices now of winter plants that will look good in a container now and then earn their place in the wider garden after you've finished with them. Now I buy a lot of plants during the course of the year. I grow lots of my own from seed as well. But I often buy plants that I'm going to put out in the garden eventually, but I can't afford to buy big mature specimens, and so I often grow them on from a small stage to a larger stage before I commit them to the garden, as it were. So buying plants smaller, cheaper, and growing them on means that you can put them in pots and you can use them in your autumn and your winter pots as a temporary measure, really, because they might look particularly attractive. So take, for example, this Mahonia. It's a little one, it's a small one. You can buy much bigger ones, but this one is a small one. It's about £12 to buy. And the beauty of this is that planting it at this size in a pot means that you can grow it on for a year or two before it gets larger, and then it gets transplanted out of this pot into the ground, by which time it's a lot bigger. So this is quite a good ornamental decorative plant. You might also buy things like this witch hazel. So there's lots of buds on this witch hazel. If you look carefully here, you can see the flower buds here, and those will come out into flower during February, March time. So this would be an equally good plant to put into this container just for the winter season. But there are also lots of other plants that I've grown that are perennial plants that come back year after year but aren't woody shrubby plants. So things like these heucheras with this lovely red foliage, I use these a lot in pots, and I've rescued these from some of my summer pots. So they'd already been knocked out of their original pots, and they're growing on really well to a nice size, but they're still fairly small, so I could grow these on for another year or so in this pot. And then I also like growing grasses, and a lot of these grasses are great in pots. This is a Carex Morowii Evergold, and this looks great because it will hang over the edge of the pot, and I use this plant quite a lot to edge summer containers but also for winter because it's bone hardy. And you can see that there's quite a big clump already here, and that means that you could actually split this into individual pieces to go around the edge of a pot and use it to propagate it. So you could plant out these small divisions from this plant, plant it around the edge of the pot, grow it on for a year so that they're big enough to then plant out. So pots of good quality compost are a really great way of growing on plants. And then I've got these other Carex here, these bronze Carex. These are a few more that I use in my pots. I think these are great because they stay all winter like this and all through the summer, and they move around in the wind really nicely. So these would be good as well. And these are growing on to a nice size now, but probably need another year in the pot. I also like this green festuca. This is a really lovely plant. Again, bone hardy, looks great as an edging plant in a border. But again, if I were to split this and grow it on for a couple of years, I would be able to propagate up lots to be able to plant out in a border. So growing in containers, really great way in the medium term of bulking up plants, growing them onto a larger size. So I'm just going to do that with this pot. This is a pot that I had summer bedding in, and it really stands by my back door and looks good all through the summer. But now I want to keep an eye on it with some things over the winter really, and I could make up a proper winter container, if you like, with lots of flowers in it. But I actually think all the foliages of lots of these plants that I'm growing on is really good together. So I'm simply going to use this Mahonia. So this is Mahonia Winter Sun. Just soak the plants thoroughly before you knock them out. I wouldn't worry about teasing the roots out. This will just grow very fibrous roots and fill in the compost really nicely. I've half filled the container and then I'm just orientating the plant because I'm going to aim to have it viewing from the front. So this plant has got quite a good face on this side, and it's slightly angled towards the viewer. So I'm just going to use that. I'm also going to then use this Carex. So this is another one that I've rescued from another container. I'm not going to split it up at this stage. I'm just going to use this in its entirety and cram it quite tightly in against the root ball of that Mahonia. And then all I'd do would be fill in with a little bit of the soil, this compost mix that I've made up, just fill in the gaps between the root balls. And this would be great on the opposite side. So this festuca with its real lime green will look great all through the winter months. Real lime greeny splash of cheeriness. So I'm going to pop that on the other side opposite the Carex, and I'm going to use these couple of smallish heucheras here. The colour on these is really terrific, particularly with that lime green, and I'm going to pack them quite closely together at the front of the pot and grow them on for another year. But it does allow you, when you knock plants out of pots, just to check whether they've got vine weevil, particularly on heucheras. See if there's any damage, if there's any of the fat juicy grubs or any of the adults lurking around. So that's a good thing to do. And I'm just going to pop these at the front, probably pop a little bit more compost in there at the front. And that's all I'm going to do really. I'm going to fill those in around the root balls with the compost. You can see that all of these set one another off, and so it creates a really good winter display just using evergreen foliage. So nothing more than evergreen foliage, colourful right the way through the winter and on into the spring. So containers and pot growing are great ways to just grow those permanent plants on to a larger size, get them big enough to then commit to the garden where you'll actually see them when they're in the garden rather than the smaller size. And of course it gives you the opportunity to really enjoy them during the winter, particularly if they've got evergreen foliage or colourful stems or berries or even flowers during the winter. You can enjoy them in that pot before committing them to the larger garden. Now, as far as those long-term plantings go, it's really important that you keep them healthy by repotting them every 2 to 3 years. You'll find that even if you make up the compost mix that I suggest, you'll find that that compost will start to deteriorate, the organic matter will be used up and burnt up. So it's really important to replace at least some, if not all, of that compost around the roots of the plants. So that will involve knocking them out, leave that until the spring, wait until about March or April time, knock the plants out of those pots, and if you want to carry on growing them in pots, then tease some of that compost away from the roots of the plants and either replace with all fresh compost pot them straight back into that existing size pot. You may need to do a little bit of root pruning, which we'll talk about in a moment, but repot into the same size pot. Or if you don't want to disturb the plant too much, then repot it into a slightly bigger pot, so that you can, probably a pot that's just large enough to get your finger down the edge of around the existing root ball, so that it's just got a little rim of extra compost around the edge to root into, and that will keep that plant happy going forward. You also do need to think about feeding, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well, but probably at this time of year, the most important thing to think about with permanently planted containers is that their root balls effectively in that container will be above ground for the winter. So that will mean that they could be exposed to frost, particularly if it's a very, very cold, frosty winter. Now, normally, of course, these plants would be growing in the earth in a garden border, and that means their roots would be insulated from the worst of that frost. But growing in a container, that frost can come in from the outside of the pot and permeate in from the outside of the pot and penetrate into the soil and possibly damage vulnerable roots underground. So wrapping the container in very, very cold weather with perhaps Hessian or even bubble wrap can help to keep those plants happy. Now, I mentioned the possibility of root pruning when you're repotting. We'll come to that in a moment. But even if you're planting out plants at this time of year, planting new plants into containers, then you may be tempted to tease the roots apart, particularly if they've grown round and round inside the pot, and you feel that some of those plants might benefit from getting their roots just coaxed out so that they'll grow into the fresh compost. Now, this is really good advice for summer flowering plants when you're planting those up in the spring, because they've got the potential to grow away really vigorously. But in the winter, you've got to remember that plants will be growing much more slowly. And if you're doing that planting now, even going into the autumn, those roots might establish and might start to grow a little bit, but they won't grow as strongly as they will in the spring going into the summer. So be rather circumspect about breaking too much of that root apart. Perhaps just gently tease them apart, or just leave them well alone if they're not showing signs of circumnavigating the inside of the pot that they've come to you in. If they really are very pot bound, then it might be just worth teasing them apart a bit. But if they're not showing signs of that, then leave well alone. Now, root pruning, I mentioned if you're going to be repotting a plant, most of that repotting wouldn't be done at this time of year. It would be done in the spring, but you might be taking plants out of pots now and repotting them into other containers, either hardy plants that you can leave out in the garden or tender plants that you're going to bring indoors. You might be well advised to prune back some of that root just so that you can get it into a smaller pot. You don't want to have to accommodate a huge root ball in an enormous pot, particularly if space is at a premium. So you can cut back some of that root on plants that you're digging up now to put into pots for overwintering, indoors or outside. You can prune back quite a large proportion of that root, but don't be too vicious. Don't take it back more than, say, half of the volume of the root, and pot it up into that nice free draining open compost mix to make sure that it doesn't rot off during the winter. But most of our root pruning should be left until the spring, when the potential for the plants to grow away strongly and make new root growth is at its best. You also really need to consider changes in seasonal watering. Now, in the hot, dry summer, you'll be wanting to water containers perhaps once or twice or even 3 times a week. And in some cases, you might be watering them every day in really well-established, fully foliaged containers. Remember that if you plant into the sort of compost mix that I'm suggesting, that compost will be much more able to retain moisture and stop the plants drying out at their roots. So much, much better for the plant health. But during the winter months, remember, plants aren't growing. They're not got the same demand for water. They're not losing so much water from their foliage and their flowers and all their other aerial parts. And also there isn't so much water evaporating from the compost itself. So the demand for water is much lower in the autumn through till the spring than it would be during the summer months when it's being used up much more quickly. But do remember that a plant pot or a container that's fully covered with foliage, it may actually divert rainfall from falling directly onto the compost and thus soaking down to the roots where it's needed by the plants. The foliage may actually divert any rainfall off to the side of the pot and away where it can't be used in the soil. So do check, even during the autumn, winter and spring, that the container, the compost in the container hasn't dried out. You need to make sure it's kept reasonably moist but not waterlogged through the winter months. And that's a really key thing to success when it comes to growing in containers over the winter. Now, feeding, crucial during the summer because we've got to keep the plants supplied with nutrients. Remember, the plants can make their own food by photosynthesizing, using their leaves, trapping sunlight energy and making their own sugars for growth, but they do need additional nutrients. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that you need to be responsible for giving the plants a square meal. The plants are able to make their own food, but what you need to do is provide them with small amounts of nutrients on a regular basis as you think they will need them. Now, that demand for nutrients will be high during the active growing periods during the late spring and into the summer months, and then really tail off very rapidly at the end of the summer, into the autumn, through the winter and into the early spring. So don't worry about feeding your plants during those months because really they don't need much in the way of nutrients. If you give them a fresh compost, then there should be a baseline of nutrients in that compost to last for at least 6 weeks and possibly longer during the winter because the plants have less demand for that nutrient during the cold winter months. Now, a way of just being really certain that you're going to give plants the right amount of nutrients is to use a slow release fertilizer, like a pellet form of slow release fertilizer that will gradually release nutrients during warmer weather, but less nutrients will be delivered from that slow release fertilizer during colder weather. So that's a really good way of taking out the guesswork of feeding. But as a rule of thumb, I would feed my plants very generously during the summer and then pretty much hold off feeding during the winter months entirely. Now, the last thing I want to consider is really whether growing in pots is sustainable or not. Whether we need to carry on growing in pots going forward or whether we can get away with growing in the open ground. Now, there's no real doubt that plants do really well if they're grown in good quality soil in the open ground. And if you have good quality soil in your garden or the potential for growing in soil somewhere, then plants will do much better grown like that because they will be less reliant on you to give them the water and also the nutrients that they need. If you don't have those sorts of facilities or you have a balcony or a paved garden, then certainly growing in pots needs to be. Do bear in mind that if you're going to grow in containers, then the bigger the pot, the better. A minimum of 45 centimetres or 18 inches in diameter and depth is a good size for a pot. The plants will be much happier in a big pot than in small pots. It means that you'll have to deliver less water, less nutrition. The plants will be less prone to drying out if you go away for a few days. They'll be much more self-sufficient in big containers filled with good quality compost. But as I say, given the choice, if you can plant plants in the open ground, then do so. And just as a little add-on, I would much prefer, if you've got a paved garden, I would much prefer to lift some of those paving slabs and try and plant in the ground underneath that paving for things like climbers and trees and also some shrubs, rather than trying to commit them to permanent growing in containers, because they'll be much more happy in the open ground. So think carefully about what you're choosing to grow and make these decisions in an informed way. So that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. We're now going to go into our question and answer session. I'll be joined by my colleague who will have been coordinating your questions as they've come in and putting them up for you to vote on. Don't forget that you've got notes that you can download either directly from this screen. To the right hand side of the viewing screen, you'll see the notes are available to download in the form of a handout. You can also ask your questions at this stage by clicking in the Q&A section, and please remember at the end of this session to give us your feedback. Anyway, now I'm going to be joined by my colleague and we're going to answer some of your questions.